So welcome and thank you for joining tonight's program. If this is your first program or it's been a while, we are the Oberlin Heritage Center. We're the local historical society of Oberlin, Ohio. Our mission is to preserve and share Oberlin's unique heritage and make our community a better place to live, learn, work, and visit. If you know Oberlin, we are located just south of the Conservatory of Music, and we are open right now with limited tours and research appointments. We're not part of the city or college, so to those of you who are already supporters out there, thank you so much. And programs like this really would not be possible without your support. And to those of you who are not members, please take a look at our website, see what we do, and consider joining. We have a quick plug for our next program that will be on May 25th at 7 o'clock, another free Zoom program. It's by historian and author Gene Schmiel, and it is about Civil War personalities. He will highlight a variety of people, famous and unsung, Black and white, Union and Confederate, who influenced the outcome and the aftermath of the American Civil War. So if you'd like to learn more about that, check out our website, oberlinheritagecenter.org, and that is where you will find the registration link as well. So, but why you are all here tonight. First, we want to acknowledge that this is a painfully relevant topic, and we know that it is not easy to experience, remember, or sometimes discuss racism and violence. But such conversations are necessary, and we thank you for sharing your time with us tonight. I will begin by introducing our panelists tonight and then turn things over to them. First, I am delighted to introduce Dr. Gretchen Sullivan Sorin, Distinguished Professor and Director of the Cooperstown Graduate Program at SUNY Oneonta, as well as a museum consultant and scholar. Dr. Sorin earned a BA from Rutgers University in American Studies, an MA in Museum Studies from the Cooperstown Graduate Program, and a PhD from SUNY Albany in History. Her presentation tonight centers around her research for the book, Driving While Black, African American Travel and the Road to Civil Rights, which led to a documentary as well. The book was ranked one of Bloomberg's best nonfiction books of 2020, was a finalist for a 2021 NAAC Image Award in the category of Outstanding Literary Work in Nonfiction. And I just saw the news today that you are also up for an award from the American Bar Association. So we're very excited to see news about that as well. Also joining us tonight is Dr. Meredith Gadsby, who will be facilitating the conversation. She is Associate Professor of Africana Studies and Comparative American Studies at Oberlin College. Dr. Gadsby also serves as the Special Assistant to the President for Racial Equity and Diversity and Commission Co-Chair of the Presidential Initiative on Racial Equity and Diversity at Oberlin College. She has myriad teaching and research interests, including literatures of the African diaspora, Black women's writing, cross-cultural theories, and migration studies, and much of her work is preoccupied with issues of migration and identity. Thank you both so much for giving your time and sharing with us tonight. I will now turn things over to Dr. Sorin for an introduction to her work, which will then be followed by the conversation.
Thank you so much, Liz. It's great to be here with Liz and Amanda, who are both former students of mine in Cooperstown, and Meredith, it's so nice to meet you, so I'm glad to be here. Let me share my screen. So I'm going to talk this evening about my research on driving while Black, African American travel, and the road to civil rights. And what you're looking at is a Buick. And as I talk a little bit more, we'll get more into automobile makes and models and why a Buick is so important to the African American community. But first of all, I'd like you to think about the issue of mobility. Mobility is something that we all take for granted in this country. And this is the Times Square subway station. And I've never seen it looking like this, but this is how it looks during COVID. And I think one of the reasons that we can all start to really understand the importance of mobility to a free society is thinking about the mobility and the way that our mobility has been restricted during this time of COVID. It just gives us a little bit of an inkling what the restriction of mobility means. But for African Americans, you really have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to slavery and think about how mobility was restricted for African Americans from the moment they stepped onto the shores of the New World. And what you have here is a pass. So for African Americans, as they traveled anywhere in the New World, if they could travel, they had to have a pass from their owner, their master, proving that they had permission to travel. And here you can see a pass from 1843. Many of the passes were just written on plain paper, like this one. This one is particularly important because it was issued at Montpelier for Mrs. James Madison, the wife of the father of the Constitution, James Madison. And also think about modern police departments and how they were formed. Most of the police departments in this country were formed as slave catchers. It would be the men and sometimes the women of the community on their horses at night, very formidable group, and they would be checking passes of enslaved people that they found out after dark, or of any Black person they found out after dark. And their goal was not just to prevent people from running away, but to intimidate them. And here you can see a slave catcher checking the passes of an enslaved individual who's out after dark. And you can see that the modern badge on the right is modeled after the runaway slave patrols, because these were the very first police departments. So for African Americans traveling in this country in the 20th century, we'll fast forward. You could travel by bus, you could travel by train, but both of these methods of transportation were segregated. And African Americans did not like to travel on public conveyances because they were segregated. This meant in a bus, sitting in the back seats, having to stand if a white person wanted to get on and needed a seat. It meant in a train, traveling in the Negro car, which was often filthy, rarely cleaned. The bathrooms were not cleaned. So it was really unpleasant. As well, the conductors and the bus drivers would often hurl epithets, and many of the bus drivers were armed and would actually, there were instances of the bus drivers not just pulling away from African American travelers, but also shooting them. And here you can see the colored car of a train car, the colored section in the back. So by the 1950s, African Americans were buying cars. With their disposable income, they were becoming consumers of automobiles, just as they were becoming consumers of percolators and refrigerators and stoves and other consumer goods. And the automobile was the preferred method of travel for African Americans because it enabled them to be in their private space and without the humiliation of public transportation. What kind of car to buy? African Americans often chose Buicks. Buicks were the most popular car. A Buick was a high-end car, and as you can see here, it was very comfortable, it was very soft, but it was important for other reasons. If you were Black and you were traveling, you might have to sleep in your car. You couldn't stop at a hotel. You might have to eat in your car. You carried a large cooler full of food. You carried blankets and pillows. Many people also carried, excuse me, a few cans of gasoline in their car in case they needed gasoline and weren't able to get a gas station to sell them gas. You carried water for the radiator. So you had to basically carry just about everything you might need along the road because you couldn't stop at a variety of places that white Americans could stop. And you wanted your car to be wide enough and heavy enough so that it would be hard to turn over if you encountered an angry mob. So this is an ad for the Buick Electra Limited, And I love this ad because it says, all the Electra Limited lacks is a fireplace. And that really indicates what African Americans were looking for. Their automobile became their rolling home on wheels that protected them from the racism that they might experience as they traveled the country. And here you can see just a snapshot of a family with their trunk open, and in the back they have their picnic basket and they have their a cooler of something to drink, and they've stopped by the side of the road. But the automobile was also important for African Americans because it was a status symbol. So during the Great Migration in the early 20th century, a large number, at least as many as 6 million African Americans, moved north from the South, from the rural South to the urban North. And they were able to get jobs in the North, many of them, and then go back to the South to show their family members and their friends how well they had done. And here you can see a couple that's done really well. They've got on their fur coats and this beautiful 1930s Cadillac. This is a photograph on a street in Harlem, New York. But even though their automobile provided a safe space, there were many dangers along the road. You might encounter a sign like this one that said, "Welcome, the Klan welcomes you." At the entrance to the state of North Carolina, there was a large billboard that said, "Welcome to Klan country." And this was the banner across the main street in Greenville, Texas. Greenville welcome, the blackest land, the whitest people. Now, Greenville did not have a very good reputation. There had been lynchings in Greenville. And so African Americans were quite frightened when they encountered this sign on the main street. And of course, there were sundown towns. There were hundreds of sundown towns all over the United States. And these were towns, many of them had signs that looked just like this, that you had to be out of by sundown, or you could face real violence. And Ohio had its share of sundown towns, including the towns of Shelby and Niles, Reading, Waverly, and Green Hills are among the sundown towns that were in the state of Ohio. Of course, automobile accidents were very dangerous for African Americans as well. There were only in the 1950s 200 what were called Negro hospitals in the United States. Hospitals were segregated, healthcare was segregated. And if you got into a car accident and you weren't near a hospital, you might just bleed to death, which is something that happened to the blues singer Bessie Smith, who was involved in a car accident and died from blood loss before she could be taken to a hospital. But this happened to a large number of African Americans who were traveling because healthcare, again, was segregated. So in 1936, Victor Green, who was a New York businessman, created a small guidebook called the Negro Motorists Green Book. And this was his mantra: travel is fatal to prejudice. He really believed that if middle-class African Americans could go out on the road and encounter white people, and white people could meet African Americans, they would realize that African Americans were just like them. So the Green Book was published from 1936 until 1966, and it was basically an alphabetical listing by state of hotels and motels, restaurants, garages, service stations, places where African Americans could stop and be welcome as they traveled in the United States. And here you have Victor and Alma Green. And I like to show the photograph of Alma because Victor Green gets sick at the end of the 1950s and Alma takes over. So really, this was a woman-owned business in the 1950s and 60s. And Alma and 4 other women ran it, which was unheard of for women to run a publishing company in the 1950s. And there were a variety of different kinds of places listed in the Negro Motorist Green Book. There were tourist homes like Rock Rest. This is a small New England tourist home in Kittery, Maine. This is a contemporary photograph that I took of Rock Rest. They provided lunches and dinners for middle-class African Americans, but they also provided week-long stays, vacation stays. And they write that this was a place where people could go and get away from the trials and tribulations of racism in the country. There were motels. Motels were becoming increasingly popular during this time period because you could hop right off of the highway and get back on the highway the next day, pull your car right up to your door. And then there were large luxury hotels like the Majestic. The Majestic was in Cleveland. It was a block long. The Majestic had a wonderful jazz club that was very popular, not only with African Americans, but with the white community as well, for many, many years. And sadly, the Majestic was torn down. But the automobile was also important to African Americans as a tool in the civil rights movement. You really could not have had the civil rights movement without the automobile. This is the Jenkins microbus, it's called, and it's at the Smithsonian now. And if you think about registering voters, you needed a vehicle if you're going to drive throughout an entire county or an entire state registering people. You couldn't do that job on foot. You had to have a vehicle. And this is one of the vehicles that was used during the civil rights movement to register voters. And of course, the boycotts, the variety of boycotts that were held in the South to desegregate the buses. This is the Montgomery Bus Boycott, Martin Luther King here on the right, ushering these women into this automobile. The bus boycotts, they were able to cut the business of the bus company by 69% by using automobiles that were purchased for this purpose to drive people to work so they wouldn't lose their jobs. And of course, that brings us to the present. This is Philando Castile. Philando Castile was stopped by the police more than 40 times in his short life before he was murdered by the police. And of course, George Floyd was in his van as well, dragged out of his van before he was murdered by Derek Chauvin. So I like to end with this cartoon, which is a little bit funny, but also a little bit sad. Handy hints for drivers stopped by the police: be courteous, obey all lawful orders, have license and registration ready, avoid being Black. I think that every mother, every African-American mother in this country dreads the time when their child will become a driver. And every mother gives their child what I call the talk. And the talk is how to behave if you're stopped, if your car is stopped by police man or woman. And the goal is, of course, to keep your child safe. And every time I've talked about this, white people say they've never thought about having to have that conversation with their child because they're not afraid of the police. But the talk is certainly something that we continue to have. So driving while Black continues to be a problem in this country. And I will stop there and entertain your questions. And I hope I've kept it into the time that I was allotted for.
You certainly have. And you pretty much have carte blanche to speak as long as you want, because people are so excited to learn more about your scholarship. I want to thank you for that presentation and your ability to condense so much into such a short period. For the viewers who've had the opportunity to read the book, along with watching the documentary, there are so many aspects of the experiences of African Americans and mobility and travel that are uncovered in both contexts. And thank you so much for sharing the places in Ohio, some of which are very near to us, where there were sundown laws. I think that's really important because there's a way in which people think that this is a past experience, right? A kind of collective American trauma that has gone away. But what your closing remarks show is that there's a direct line between 400 years ago, the experiences of African Americans, limited mobility, to say the least, forced movement, and what we're experiencing in the present day. So I want to thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm wonderful to be able to have this conversation with a broader community with another SUNY sister. I went to SUNY Binghamton, so it's so good to be. It's like SUNY represents, fantastic.
Yay.
For those of you who don't know, that's State University of New York. I wanted to start with basically the question that I'm going to begin with is reflects on the points that you just raised. And they have to do with a long history of policing. There is quite a bit of conversation now about what to do with policing, right, as an institution in the United States, given its problematic history and given the ways that we keep seeing kind of the same experiences in terms of the policing of Black bodies playing out over and over again. There was a term that was shared in the documentary, democratic personhood, right? And so I'm wondering, how do we even begin as a nation to talk about the idea of democratic personhood when we have our most recent example on Saturday of Dante Wright, a 20-year-old Black man from Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, who was murdered by police. Obviously, Sandra Bland, who we see in your documentary, Richard Hubbard, who's right here in Euclid, Ohio, in the Cleveland area, Aisha Harper, and then we also, and Jacob Blake, of course. And we also see all these representations in the mass media by Black directors and creatives who are spending a lot of time on talking about the everyday lived experiences of Black people with this type of policing. From kind of this resurgence of Black horror, for instance, in Lovecraft Country, we see examples of that. We actually see a Black woman driving by herself, right? Which to many viewers might have seemed inconsequential, but to many Black viewers, I know I was terrified for her because she was a Black woman driving by herself, recreating kind of that journey of cataloging places that would have been in a travel guide because her husband was doing that work. We also see a representation of this in the series Queen Sugar, right? Where there's a young Black man is pulled over and harassed. He's not murdered, but almost is. And so how do we talk about kind of re-education and training of police alongside thinking about the kind of problematic narrative that there is anything that Black people really can do to protect ourselves when we're dealing with this experience? Yeah.
I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think there are a couple of things that we should be thinking of. Berkeley, California has just changed the way that they do their policing. They will no longer have people with guns stopping motorists. I think that the police decided, and they've decided that with the war on drugs and the war on crime, the way that you stop those wars is to stop drivers that you suspect of being guilty of something. And we have empowered the police to stop you if you have a cracked taillight, if you have the light out over your driver's license, over your license plate, if you have a broken window, you can be stopped. This is an invasion of privacy that would not be tolerated in your home.
Right.
But it's tolerated in your car. And they're often trumped up charges because you either have a car that the police view as too fancy, or you have a car that they view as too crummy. You have a lot of Black adults riding in the car together. There are a variety of things that they perceive of as suspicious when they're not suspicious at all. And so what Berkeley has done is there will no longer be people with guns stopping motorists. The people that are stopping motorists for traffic infractions will be unarmed, and you are only permitted to stop. If you stop a person because they're speeding, you can give them a ticket for speeding. You don't drag them out of the car. You don't search their car. You don't use it as a pretext, in other words, for a search, an illegal search. And I think if you want to, people break the law, right? They speed. They
Mhm.
and these are minor infractions, and these are not infractions for which the death penalty is a penalty. The penalty is a
Mhm.
ticket. So let the people giving tickets not be armed police officers, but
Mhm.
be traffic enforcement officers.
Mhm.
The other thing I think police departments can do, and I believe that we should have an ombudsman in
Mhm. Mhm.
cities who is there to protect the rights of the public
Mhm.
and who is clearly not in the, is clearly an independent person. I think that's important.
Mhm.
So there should be more civilian oversight of policing. But it's also possible that the police are more of a partnership with mental health professionals, with
Mm.
people who are experts in homelessness, with people who are experts in drug addiction and the care for people on drugs, so that you can call the appropriate person when there's a
Mhm.
call, a domestic call, rather
Mhm.
than having a gun be the first line of defense. And I
Mhm.
think it's really important that the police spend a lot of time on the shooting range.
Mhm.
They have to go regularly, monthly, to shoot. They don't get monthly training in how to diffuse a problem,
Mhm.
how to diffuse a violent situation, or how to diffuse any situation, how to
Mhm.
diffuse a domestic disturbance. They don't get the kind of psychological training
Mhm.
that they need to
Mhm.
de-escalate a situation rather than escalate a situation.
Mhm.
And I think they need to spend as much time in training on de-escalation as they spend in training on shooting.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that's
Mhm.
where I would start.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Those are some really important points. And there are some examples as well, I believe in Georgia, in Atlanta, where there have been some organizations that have been trying to find ways um, to support police who are police in certain districts. I know it's near Grady Hospital, to incentivize not arresting people, right? To remit them to spaces where they can get resources that they need, because everyone understands that recidivism is a clear problem. And basically, if people don't have the situation that forced their hand into, that resulted in the arrest persists even after they're released. And so without ongoing support, right, in the community, you basically just create a revolving door, right, where
Right.
people are arrested, released, and it's the same problem over and over again. And so going back to this idea, I think all of this really connects to the idea of democratic personhood and the absence of it, or the absence of access to it. So a lot of the conversation in the book and in the documentary focused on the ways in which cars become safe spaces, right? For Black people traveling. Can you talk a bit more about some of these safe spaces that were created by folks, places that many of us didn't even know about? I had no idea that there were communities in spaces like Denver, for instance, that were created as spaces of leisure for Black people. Can you share a bit
So,
more with us about those?
throughout the United States, there were African American resorts. There was American Beach in Florida. There was Oak Bluffs, which is still a summer Black community on Martha's Vineyard. There was a Black community in Idlewild in Michigan. And the problem was that you had to travel from one safe Black space to another safe Black space. And in between, you had to go through these white spaces that could be quite dangerous. And that's the reason for carrying your blankets and pillows, your all of your food, and for not stopping. And African Americans tended to drive at night because it was less likely that you could be seen at night. It's less likely that law enforcement would see who was in the car. It's less likely that if you're going through some small little town that they would see who was in the car. So that becomes a safer space for you. So you traveled when it was dark. But Val Verde in California was another of those resort communities. And really the only one that is still operational as a resort community is Oak Bluffs on Martha's Vineyard. All of the others, although there have been some efforts to get Idlewild going again as a concert venue. Most of the others are gone.
Right, right. And what about the Black-owned institutions that were established for folks as they travel between these spaces? Can you talk to us a bit about Black can you talk to us a bit about Black entrepreneurship?
One of the things that my friend Craig Wilder says in the film, he says, we don't have to be nostalgic about this, but there was this incredible network across the country of Black-owned businesses, ranging from gas stations and mom and pop restaurants to very fine dining restaurants, places where you could feel welcome, where you could stop for the night, hotels, motels, and luxury hotels like the Majestic or like the Hampton House, which was in Miami. And you planned your trip thoroughly before leaving. So you got out all your maps and you got out your guidebooks and you planned that trip, and you planned every place you would stop along the way using the Green Book. And if you can imagine, people wrote letters in those days. They didn't get on the phone and make their reservation or go online and make their reservation. They wrote a letter and said, do you have a room for this night? Many of these places were private homes. So when if a woman had an extra room or two after her children were grown, she could support her family and support her husband's job with basically operating the first bed and breakfasts. These were really early bed and breakfasts, where women would open up their spare bedrooms and they would provide breakfast and sometimes dinner for Black travelers. But there are also examples of people who would stay at the pastor's house. If you're driving and you got stuck and you really needed a place to stay, you could find a Black church and you would go to the pastor and ask the pastor, who could I stay with? Sometimes I had heard a few stories that were very funny of people staying at the funeral home. Funeral parlor had a few extra bedrooms, and you walked past the coffins and up the stairs, and you stayed at the funeral home because those were generally large houses and there were lots of bedrooms. So people took care of one another along the road, which I think was pretty terrific. And as you went west, there were fewer and fewer places.
Right.
So as you got to the Mississippi, there were lots of places. Chicago, there were lots of places. But as you went further west, there were fewer and fewer places to stay. So if you were headed to the national parks, you might be quite surprised to find that there were relatively few places for African Americans to stay in some of the Western states. Until you got to California, until you got to the West Coast.
Right. I was just going to ask about that. And so that journey as well, right? We talk about traveling through all of these small towns, right? And finding these pockets of relative safety. You do spend a lot of time talking about what impact the interstate highway program then has on these kids. So that coincides with integration. Can you talk a bit more about that transition and what that means for Black entrepreneurship as well?
Yeah, well, the other thing that the guidebooks do is provide incredible marketing for these small businesses across the country. So a mom and pop business, a motel, or that couldn't really afford to do national marketing, got national marketing from these guidebooks. So that was a good thing. African Americans, once the interstate highways are built, like to stay on the highways. If you stay on the highway, you don't have to go through these little towns. You don't have to worry that you might encounter an angry mob in these little towns. You just stick on that highway and you pull off on a rest area and you have your meal, or you sleep, whatever you need to do. The problem is that when the interstate highways get put through, they're often put through Black communities, Black neighborhoods. So the irony there is that these highways that are so important for African Americans traveling are also destroying many Black neighborhoods. So it's it's an ironic and a sad thing. But also Black people are building motels along the highways too, so that there are places for Black people to stay as they travel.
One of the most chilling parts of the documentary that I saw was, I believe it was a scholar named Christopher West at Pasadena College, really bringing home the challenge really of doing this work. And all of the scholars, Faith Sims and all the other folks who spoke about this experience in personal terms,
Mhm.
you know, when he talked about having the talk with his, and you did as well, having that talk with his own children. And can you share with us, you know, as a scholar and as a mother, as you identified yourself as a grandmother, you know, how do you have these types of conversations with people that you care about, you know, when it comes to thinking about, you know, driving as a Black person, as a man or a woman? And I appreciate that you shared the kind of the challenges for both men and women, right?
Mhm.
In this context too.
So one of the things that happened as we worked on this, working with Rick was wonderful in the documentary, but we
Mhm.
wanted the voices in the film to be Black voices. So you'll
Mhm.
notice that most of the scholars
Yes.
are African American.
Yes, I did.
And as we as we worked on the film, it became so clear that it was not just about scholarship, but it was very personal. You know, it
Right.
was about our own experiences
Mhm.
as parents as well as scholars.
Mhm.
And Dr. West, he just started to cry
Yeah.
in the middle of the documentary because he was thinking about his son. He says he's a
Mhm.
good kid. He's a good kid. But when the police see him, they don't see a good kid. They see a Black kid,
Mhm.
and they're afraid, and they have guns. So, you know, each of us talked about from our own perspective. I live in a rural area
Mhm.
where there aren't very many Black people, and talking to my son, another good kid, not wanting him to be afraid. I don't want to, you know, I didn't want to raise a kid who was terrified. At the same time, I wanted him to be careful
Mhm.
and to be mindful of the fact that when he was stopped by the police would not say good kid, they would say Black kid, you know, and they would have possibly a preconceived idea about who he was, an idea that was not correct.
Mhm.
And so how do we deal with that? How do we keep our children safe when they're not near us? And I think Faith Ruffins, who's a curator at the Smithsonian, she says she told her kids, you know, just be polite, and you have to live long enough for us to get to the police station to take
Mhm.
care of you, to protect you.
Mhm. Mhm.
So don't do anything that would endanger your life. You have to live
Mhm.
long enough for us to get to you. And that
Mhm.
is kind of chilling
Mhm.
thought in a free society.
Mhm. And then she also said, and we also know that that might not be enough, right?
Right,
And there are
right,
other people in documentary who said that. Then there's the other narrative that, as if there is anything that you can really do.
right.
I think that was a really powerful point. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the scholar who shared that, but you know, another scholar, Imani Perry, talks about kind of these racialized narratives, right? So people have these questions about, well, what happens when, you know, the police officers aren't necessarily white? And, you know, I think Imani Perry would answer is that, you know, white supremacy is a system that has direct impact on all of us in multiple ways. And policing is an institution. So one can be white, can practice white supremacy within the context of that institution
Oh,
of
yes,
any race, right?
yes.
And so
The research
that
shows that. The research
exactly.
shows that the officers that are most likely to drag you out of your car, to arrest you, or to search your car are white males. The second group are Black males.
Mhm.
The people who are the least likely to search your car are women.
Wow, that's really interesting. That part I did not know. That's really interesting. And so how do you, if you could talk a bit more, you did mention in this presentation, especially for the viewers who might not have been able to see all of the documentary or read the book, how you spent some time talking about the Montgomery boycott and the importance of mobility in that context, and actually having an automobile, right? The freedom that represents. Do you see any connection between kind of that narrative of freedom via the automobile and being able to carpool, and then thinking about the folks who had the resources to purchase cars as well, and kind of contemporary activism in terms of the way people are mobilizing within the context of Black Lives Matter and Say Her Name and so on?
Oh, that's very interesting. I've not even given that a thought. Hadn't even raised that.
Because there's a way in which people are utilizing social media in really powerful ways. So using GoFundMe and so on to rent buses, right? If you think about all the people who've traveled to Minneapolis and traveled to Ferguson and so on to do that work, and the ways in which people are using trains and so on, but also carpooling in that context.
Well, and that's been going on from the very beginning. I mean, during the civil rights movement, people were doing exactly the same thing with automobiles and trains and buses to go south. And all of these places that provided housing for them were these businesses, these African-American businesses that fed them and provided places for them to stay. I assume that the same thing is happening now, but they can stay in many more places that are available to them. But I hadn't thought. That's a very good point about the buses and the automobiles being used for Black Lives Matter. Yeah, that's a great point.
It's interesting, and I think it's one of the things that you see, especially working with students, right? Working with college students, the way that they manage to get to where they need to go, but also work collectively to be able to do the activist work that they do, right? I'm not sure where we are with time, Liz. I know you wanted to entertain some questions from the audience. And so I'm wondering would you like to do that now? I could ask 1,000 questions, but I'm happy to stand down.
We do have quite a few in queue, so if you don't mind,
Great.
Amanda
I would love that.
She has been looking at the list, so she will start feeding them to both of you.
Wonderful.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions and quite a few thank yous to both of you, to you, Dr. Sorin, for bringing attention to this very important and relevant topic.
Well, thank you.
So I'm going to kind of go through some more of the questions, but thank you everybody for your responses so far. Steve asked, were there any integrated places around the country, and did the Green Book list any of those?
So as we get into the 1960s, there were organizations and individuals in the country that supported integration, and there were actually some guidebooks, excuse me, that listed places that were integrated, so that if you were committed to integration, you could stay there. I also found a place in Seattle, in Chinatown. Chinatown, Seattle is on the edge of the Black community, and the man that owned this hotel in Chinatown felt a real affinity for African Americans because of how the Chinese and all Asian people were treated on the West Coast. And so he permitted African Americans to stay at his hotel as well. So it was kind of a Chinese African American hotel. But yes, there were places that were integrated. Most of them were generally not in the Green Book. They were in other guidebooks.
Well, that kind of leads into this next question. Does anything like the Green Book, the travel guide, still exist?
There have been a couple. There have been a couple of opportunities for people to create lists of Black businesses on the internet recently as a result of everything that happened last summer. So, I don't know that it's the same. It's not the same as a guidebook, but there are lists now of Black businesses, so that if you want to support African American businesses around the country, you can find these lists on Twitter and in social media. There's also been a booklet that was created by a woman called the Green Book, but it's really more about it's about dangerous places rather than about positive places to stay. It talks about states you'd rather not travel in rather than places you want to go. The state of Missouri, I believe, the NAACP, named Missouri as a state that was dangerous for African Americans.
Thank you. Shonda says, thank you for presenting this timely conversation. And she wanted to know, how do we begin to unpack having these conversations with our youth? For example, she just told an adolescent that, they have inherited trauma just because of the color of their skin, and we must begin to have these open conversations about it so we can prepare them for something that seems inevitable.
How do we have these conversations with kids? I think textbooks have to change, and I think curriculum has to change. I've been talking to some high schools about driving while Black, and I think it's a subject that kids can engage in high school. They're thinking about driving. They're getting to that age, and I think it's the kind of subject that we really should engage our kids in when they're in high school. It doesn't need to wait until they're adults. I also have been talking to the National History Day people about taking on a subject like protest, like social protest, as one of the themes for National History Day. So I would encourage high school kids, middle and senior high school kids, to get involved with National History Day, because it's really an opportunity for kids to look at primary source material and learn how to use it and analyze it and make their own decisions about history and really kind of dive into it.
David asks, if the Green Book stopped publishing in 1966, what happened economically to the businesses that had been listed? It's hard to imagine that public accommodation opened up instantly after federal legislation.
Well, actually, what happened was that Hilton Hotel and Howard Johnson's were the test cases, and they opened up immediately. Hilton and Howard Johnson's all over the country, they opened up immediately. And what happened was, this is in 1964 when the civil rights legislation was passed, and the African American hotels and motels started to go out of business. And they didn't go out of business because every African American person stopped using them. They went out of business because no white people started using them when they lost their African American audiences or visitors. So it was a case of at the same time that there was direct action in the streets, there was a lot of action going on in the courts as well. And the courts were filing lawsuits against hotel segregation, particularly in Hilton and Howard Johnson's. When those were broken open, African Americans went there because they could, because they had worked so hard to break open Hilton hotels and the large chains. And so that really cut the business of these African American hotels and motels and restaurants significantly, and they started to go out of business. You can still go to Dookie Chase's in New Orleans, which is still open. There are still a few places around the country that are still open, that were open, during the period of segregation, but most of them have closed. I think only about 5% of the Green Book sites are even still standing.
Carolyn asks, what are your thoughts today about having separate leisure places for Blacks? You had mentioned Martha's Vineyard. Does that seem to be counterproductive in bringing people together?
Well, I guess people want to feel comfortable when they go on vacation. You know, they've dealt with the stress of all of the microaggressions that they feel during the week at work, and I guess they want to, you know, get away from that stress. And one way to do that is a place where they're not going to experience it at all. So I understand why Martha's Vineyard is popular. It's also got a long history, and it's traditional for many families to go there. There are not a lot of other places like that. So, you know, those places have long since gone out of business.
Thank you. Jennifer asks, was the Green Book published annually, and were the businesses able to apply to be in them?
The Green Book was published annually, and so basically it was word of mouth. This is the kind of first generation of African-American corporate executives. So, you know, Seagram's was hiring people, and Coca-Cola was hiring people, men, of course. So you have these Black corporate executives, and they're traveling, and they need a place to stay, and it's got to be a nice place. And one of the problems was that you didn't know if a place was really nice or not, that you would be staying at. And baseball players were traveling, you know, sports athletic folks were traveling, and musicians were traveling, and they needed places to stay. And so now I've just lost my train of thought. Ask that question again, please.
Sorry, I just gotta find it again.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Were the businesses able to apply to be in the Green
Okay.
Book?
So so Green had agents, and they were all over the United States. And these agents helped him find places that were acceptable. And the agents were often people who worked at HBCUs, at historically Black colleges and universities, that had singing groups. And these were the singing groups, like the Fisk Singers, that went out across the country. And when they went out across the country, they needed places to stay. So they kind of knew, you know, what was a nice place to stay and what was an acceptable place to stay. And he also solicited word of mouth testimonials. So if you were a traveler, a Black traveler, and you went out and you stayed at a really nice place, he wanted to know about it. And people wrote to him, he wrote to him and said, you know, this is a great place to stay. Why don't you try the Bluebird Inn in Virginia? Or why don't you try the Majestic Hotel in Cleveland? So they had small little, just a line that would say, the Bluebird Inn in, Newport News, Virginia. I don't know where it was, but, you know, just one line. If you didn't pay, if you paid, you could get a display ad, which could have your picture in it. It could have a photograph of your hotel, or restaurant. It could have, or your gas station. It could have, you know, all of the amenities that you were offering, air conditioning or tiled bathrooms, whatever. And so there were a whole variety of ranges of kinds of ads that you could have, or just a simple listing, which was very much like a phone book, you know, just your name, address, and later on there were phone numbers.
Excellent. Jamie was curious if there was a sundown law in Wapkinetta, Ohio, and I'm not sure if you came across that name at all in your research.
I have no idea about that particular town.
I did.
Yeah, go ahead.
I did a quick search, and it seems like there might be some, not quite oral histories, but just memories of people who have been through the town, but maybe TBD.
And there were kind of degrees of sundown towns. Some of them had signs, like the one I showed you, at the entrance of the town and the exit of the town. Some of them had, there was one town in the Midwest that had a siren that went off at 6 o'clock, which meant you better be out of that town. Some of them had protective covenants on all the properties, which meant an African-American couldn't buy property in that town. Some of those protective covenants covered Native Americans, Mexicans, Jews, and African Americans. So they kept everybody out that wasn't white. So they're kind of degrees of sundown towns. One of the things that there are some of these towns that have no African Americans in them now, and that is somewhat of an indicator of why of that it was a sundown town historically. But I don't know about that particular place in Ohio. But there is a book, James Lowen, it's called Sundown Towns, and it might be in there.
Great. Faith says that white friends who want to practice anti-racism often ask me what they can do to help make the world safer for Black people. What are some responses I can give them?
If they see a Black person being pulled over, they can pull over and just sit there and watch, or tape it with their phone if they are of a mind to do that. They can get involved with their local police department and be a person who is involved in citizen engagement in the police department, making sure that the police are have feedback from the local community, and that we are the ones that enable, we give the power to the police. That's the role of citizens, to give the power to the police. So we should also be the ones that let the police know what we want, what our expectations are. I want the police to fight crime. I don't want them to waste their time looking for marijuana joints in some kid's car. I want them to, catch the bad guys and take care of the bad guys. What they're doing is counterproductive, because we know from research that the random stopping of vehicles is not a crime fighting tool and is not effective. I believe the statistic is that less than 10% of the cars that are stopped and searched for some sort of probable cause, that the police just looking at the car think they're going to find something, that 10% they maybe find a joint or a small quantity of contraband 10% of the time. So that means 90% of the time there is nothing that they're finding. So they should spend their time fighting crime, real crime, and not searching cars, because it's just not productive. It's not effective police work. And we should be able to have other individuals do traffic enforcement, in my opinion.
Well, we still have so many questions, but we are running out of time here. But
you can ask a couple of more if you want.
Okay, well, maybe a couple more. So Leanne was wondering, how did people acquire the Green Book or any of the other smaller publications?
Victor Green was a very smart businessman. He made a deal with Standard Oil, which is, we think of it as ExxonMobil. It was then Esso Gasoline. And in that deal, they bought thousands of copies and they distributed them at Esso gas stations. So you could buy a copy from Victor Green, you could buy it by the mail, or you could pick it up at an Esso gas station. And I will say, African Americans used Esso gas, and the reason they used Esso gas was that Esso permitted African Americans to use their bathrooms, which there were no convenience stores, so you couldn't go to a convenience store and go to the bathroom. If you were on the road and you needed to go to the bathroom, you either went in the bushes or you found an Esso gas station that had restrooms. And so because Esso was the only oil company that permitted Black people to use their bathrooms, Black people bought Esso gas.
Great. I think the final question, and I think this might be where Liz might want to chime in a little bit as well, is basically, how will we follow up? Will there be a follow-up Zoom discussion to discuss this topic further? in today's issues?
That is a great question, and I don't have a great answer. I mean, in terms of the Historical Society, we are always trying to do a better job of documenting the history of everyone within Oberlin and trying to call attention to our own areas where, you know, Oberlin did not hold up to its racial equality ideals. And we have stories like that, and we're always documenting more. We're doing oral histories with people. I mean, we do have people telling us about instances of redlining and police being called on them more often than other people. So I think that is how we are following up as an organization. We will continue to look for programs like this because this is certainly not a one and done. This is an ongoing marathon of trying to, you know, preserve and share this history. So I don't have a definite answer for you, except that all of it is in our future.
Liz, you were, I don't know if you were in Sarah Farron's class, were you?
Not the same year. I know the organization she's been part of, though.
Because Sarah has been working with us on a national dialogue program. And it's a program to bring community members together to have discussions about this subject. So you might, and around using the clips from the documentary as the catalyst. So that might be something that you could do.
That sounds wonderful, especially when we have people saying that's what they want to do. So we need to hear your feedback. So thank you. Are there more questions, Amanda?
There are. There are a few more here.
Okay. Maybe just two more, and then Dr. Sorin and Dr. Gadsby, I just want to let you know, I will give you both a chance for final remarks. Anything you wanted to share with the group before we sign off, but maybe one or two more questions, and then I'll start with you, Dr. Gadsby, and then end with you, Dr. Sorin.
Jessica stated that she was glad that you mentioned the statistics regarding white officers and the fact that Black officers also abuse their power. For white officers, people automatically assume that this is due to racism. Is there any research to identify why male Black police officers abuse power? It baffles her because they can be subject to the same treatment if stopped out of uniform.
I think Dr. Gadsby mentioned that, you know, it's, you don't have to be white to be a part of a white supremacy system. And police officers are in this brotherhood, you know, and they really, I understand that they get angry when people don't obey them. And I understand that they get angry when, you know, the recently they got the two officers that got angry when the, and this was something that I've been trained to do. If I'm stopped by police, I'm not going to stop on a dark road. I'm going to drive very slowly with my flashers on to a well-lit area. Because you don't even know if the person behind you in an unmarked car is a police officer. It could be, you know, a really scary person. So you want to drive to an area that's well lit. That's legal to do that. The the military man, the Army lieutenant that was stopped, the police officers were angry that he didn't stop immediately. He was afraid. So he drove to a well lit area and he pulled over, and they were angry about that. And so they really hassled him. I mean, they pepper sprayed him. They build up this anger that you're not obeying. I don't think enough research has been done. And this is something a colleague of mine has written a book called Suspect Citizens, which is a really interesting study of 100 million police stops. He talks about the fact that we don't have enough research on this. And this would be, you know, psychologists doing psychological research on why this happens and how and whether or not anti-bias training can be helpful. We don't know if it's the people that decide they want to be police officers. Is that the problem? Or is it the brotherhood itself, or is it the anger? We don't really know exactly what causes some police officers to behave in that way. Or all of the above, or all of those things.
Mhm. You kind of addressed this a little bit earlier, but how can we as mothers instill fairness and justice in our middle school age children? I usually have my children watch documentaries and movies with me, trying to do my part.
I think there are a lot of wonderful books for middle school kids out there that address in a positive way, but some of the issues, they're great books. What is it? Number the Stars, about the Holocaust. And, there are a lot of books that kids can read that help them to learn empathy. And I think that's really important. I think there are a lot of museums now that are starting to talk about some of these issues and to show exhibitions and films that are helpful in training children. But more than anything else, I think it's important for kids to have contact, have friendships with people who are different from them, whatever that difference may be, and to really get to know people. I think one of the problems in this country is we don't know one another. And we don't have friends that are, I always ask my students, how many of you, I teach a course in African American art, and I often start by saying, raise your hand. How many of you have a Black friend or a Latino friend or an Asian friend, somebody who is totally different from you? And you would be surprised at how many people have never met anybody or been friends with anybody who's different from them. So I think that finding those places where kids can have friends who are different backgrounds and cultures really makes a difference.
Wonderful. How can participants follow up with you?
I can't put my email is Gretchen, GRETCHEN Sorin, SORIN @Oneonta, ONEONTA.edu.
We could put that in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's most of what we have. So turn it back over to Liz.
Thank you, Amanda, and thanks for putting that into a chat to all of the attendees. Let me pin you, Dr. Gadsby, as well. So, well, first of all, I just want to thank you both so much for sharing your expertise and your thoughts. And I know these were some very, hard questions from audience members. Not that the questions were hard, but that, they're dealing with, we want to do the right thing and look into these things deeper. So thank you so much for sharing and answering those questions. And this is when we would all give you a massive applause. So please imagine everyone in the audience doing that right now. But as I said, I wanted to give you both an opportunity to have any final remarks. So we will start with you, Dr. Gadsby, and then finish with Dr. Sorin.
I just want to thank Dr. Sorin again for this presentation, for the scholarship, for the book, and the care and attention taken with the documentary. I think it is excellent. And I really appreciated the note on which it ended, from a space of empowerment and ongoing activism and agitation in Black communities. The entire documentary ends with a quote from James Baldwin's "The Fire Next Time." And as a professor of literature and Africana studies, it was the perfect note to end on. I also appreciated that you ended with young people who are mobilized in activism in the present. The video of the press conference in which Letitra Woodman, Jacob Blake's sister, said, "I'm not sad, I'm not sorry, I don't want your pity, I want change." And I think that was a really important place to end, because what we saw throughout the work, throughout the book and throughout the documentary, were the ways in which African Americans have always created institutions, have always fought in the midst of all of this horror, also found spaces of joy where it could truly affirm, right, and celebrate our humanity. And I think that that is a really important thing to underscore, that however we were treated, whatever the hostility that we experienced, despite these institutional attempts to kind of keep us, to police our bodies in multiple ways, we have consistently resisted, and continue to. And so I want to thank you for that, because, and you don't have to be a parent to feel this, because one of his other sisters said, you know, when you hear his name, think of him as a son, as a brother, as an uncle, as a father. You don't necessarily have to only be a parent to feel, you know, the kind of tragedy of all of this, and the immediacy and importance of the work that you and other folks are doing. I thank you for sharing your own experience, you know, and I, as a mother of 3 children, I have a 16-year-old who's so excited. He's just gotten his temps and he can't wait to drive. And he keeps asking me why everyone else seems to be so happy that he's able to drive, except for me. And I had to tell him that it's not that I'm not happy for him, that I'm proud of him, but I am afraid of what could happen to him if I'm not there to protect him. Right. And I'm afraid for his brother, and I'm afraid for my daughter, and I'm afraid for all of us, really. Right. My uncles, my husband, my brother, you know, for so many of us. In spite of that, though, we have to create opportunities for our children to feel affirmed and feel joy and feel joy filled in order to survive all of this, not just to survive, but to thrive. So I thank you for embedding that into your text and into the documentary.
Well, thank you. And I will just say, well, thank you so much, Meredith and Amanda and Liz. I appreciate it. It's been a great evening. And I appreciate all of the very thoughtful questions. And I would just say, with both the documentary and the book, my intention with the book, and Rick and my intention with the documentary, was to be a call to action. You know, it was to say to people, you can get involved in your community. You can get involved in this. African Americans are only, I think, 12 or 13% of the US population. And we need allies, and we need collaborators who are white in this struggle. And so for everyone who's out there who's African American, I say, you know exactly how important this is. For those of you that are white, we need you as allies and collaborators. And I hope that this book and this film provide that impetus for you to get involved in your own communities, in your own police departments, in your own schools, in your own neighborhoods. So thank you very much.
Thank you both so much. And thank you all to everyone who is attending tonight. And we wish you all a lovely evening and a nice week. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz and Amanda.
Yes. Bye.